Rain battered the cathedral windows, turning the colored saints within the stained glass into blurred ghosts swimming through crimson and gold light. Outside, carriages lined the cobbled streets of London like black funeral processions, their lacquered doors glistening beneath the storm. Inside, the air smelled of wet wool, candle wax, lilies, and anticipation. The aristocracy of England had assembled beneath the vaulted ceiling of St. Bartholomew's to witness either a glorious union or a magnificent disgrace. No soul present could yet determine which fate awaited the morning. Lady Eleanor Ashcombe stood alone before the altar in ivory satin that shimmered beneath the chandeliers. Pearls rested against the graceful line of her throat, though their pale glow could not conceal the strain in her posture. Her gloved hands remained carefully folded at her waist, but one trembling finger betrayed the storm raging beneath her composure. Behind her, whispers drifted through the pews like poisonous perfume. They say the Duke delayed the ceremony deliberately. Her father ruined his family. She should consider herself fortunate he arrived at all. Eleanor kept her gaze fixed upon the towering doors of the cathedral. Beyond them waited either salvation or humiliation, and she no longer trusted herself to hope for either. 3 months earlier, her father's death had left the Ashcombe estate drowning in debt and scandal. Creditors prowled their halls like wolves. Servants had vanished one by one. Invitations ceased arriving. Even old friends crossed the street rather than acknowledge her carriage. Then the Duke of Ravenshire had appeared with an offer of marriage so sudden and coldly formal that it resembled a legal sentence more than a proposal. The organ thundered abruptly through the cathedral. Every head turned. The great doors opened to reveal Adrian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshire, standing motionless beneath the rain-darkened archway. Water gleamed upon the broad shoulders of his black coat. He wore no ceremonial silver, no white rose upon his lapel, no trace of bridal celebration. He looked less like a bridegroom than a man arriving to witness an execution. A hush spread through the cathedral. Adrian walked slowly down the aisle, his boots echoing against the marble floor with dreadful calm. Women lowered their fans. Gentlemen straightened uneasily. His face possessed the severe beauty of carved stone, sharp cheekbones shadowed beneath dark eyes that revealed neither tenderness nor uncertainty. Yet when his gaze settled upon Eleanor, something flickered there briefly, like lightning hidden within distant clouds. He stopped before her. For one suspended heartbeat, Eleanor allowed herself to believe he might soften. Instead, his voice cut through the cathedral with merciless clarity. "Take off the wedding dress," he said coldly. "This marriage was only revenge." A horrified murmur rippled through the guests. Some ladies gasped. Others leaned forward with morbid fascination, eager to savor the ruin unfolding before them. Eleanor felt the words strike her like winter seawater. For an instant, the cathedral seemed to tilt beneath her feet. Heat rose painfully beneath her collar while hundreds of eyes fixed themselves upon her humiliation. Adrian did not look away. "My father died in disgrace because of yours," he continued quietly. "The Ashcombe name poisoned everything it touched. Consider this union repayment for old debts." The cruelty of his restraint wounded more deeply than rage might have done. He spoke not with fury, but with disciplined bitterness polished over many years. Eleanor understood that he had rehearsed this moment countless times. Every whisper surrounding their engagement had been true. She was not a bride. She was vengeance draped in lace. A bishop shifted nervously near the altar. "Your Grace," the old man murmured, "perhaps this discussion belongs elsewhere." "No," Adrian replied. "It belongs precisely here." The storm outside intensified, rain hammering against the cathedral roof while thunder rolled above the city like distant cannon fire. Eleanor lowered her gaze briefly toward the bouquet of white lilies trembling within her hands. Shame pressed against her ribs so fiercely she feared she might collapse before the entire assembly. Yet beneath that humiliation, another feeling slowly awakened. Pride. Sharp and burning. She lifted her chin. "If revenge is your Grace's purpose," she said steadily, "then you shall discover hatred makes a colder companion than loneliness." The whispering ceased. Adrian stared at her with sudden intensity, as though he had expected tears instead of defiance. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For the first time since entering the cathedral, uncertainty touched his expression. Then, without another word, he extended his arm. The gesture shocked the congregation more than the insult itself. Eleanor hesitated only briefly before placing her gloved hand upon his sleeve. The ceremony proceeded beneath suffocating silence. Their vows sounded less like promises than funeral rites. Adrian never once looked toward her while speaking. When the bishop declared them husband and wife, no applause followed. Only the crackling of candle flames and the restless shifting of silk echoed through the cathedral. Hours later, night swallowed Ravenshire Manor beneath sheets of rain. The estate loomed against the darkness like a mourning castle, its countless windows glowing through the storm. Eleanor arrived exhausted, her wedding gown heavy with damp air and disappointment. Servants bowed stiffly as she crossed the marble entrance hall, though none welcomed her aloud. A maid escorted her upstairs to chambers vast enough to dwarf loneliness itself. Firelight flickered against crimson wallpaper. Fresh logs crackled within the hearth. Upon the bed rested a velvet box tied with black ribbon. After the maid departed, Eleanor approached it cautiously. Inside lay a sapphire necklace of astonishing beauty, each blue stone deep as midnight water. Beneath it rested a folded note written in firm masculine script. "You should hate me for giving you this." Eleanor touched the necklace, her pulse quickening as thunder murmured beyond the windows. Only then did she notice the final detail hidden beneath the lid, the initials of Adrian's dead mother engraved beside the sapphires, as though the Duke had surrendered something sacred entirely while pretending to offer only cruelty. Morning arrived at Ravenshire Manor beneath a veil of silver fog that swallowed the distant hills and softened the ancient towers into pale shadows. Eleanor awoke in unfamiliar silence, the vast bed curtains surrounding her like velvet prison walls. For several moments she remained motionless, staring at the canopy overhead while fragments of the previous evening returned with merciless clarity. The cathedral whispers Adrian's cold declaration, the sapphire necklace hidden within its black velvet case. Even now the jewels rested upon the dressing table near the window, catching weak dawn light like frozen tears. A knock sounded softly at the chamber door. "Enter," Eleanor said. Two maids stepped inside carrying steaming water and folded gowns. Neither woman met her eyes for long. Their politeness carried the stiffness of servants uncertain whether their new duchess deserved sympathy or ridicule. London's gossip traveled faster than winter wind, and Ravenshire Manor had undoubtedly feasted upon the scandal before midnight struck. "The Duke has departed for Parliament, Your Grace," one maid murmured carefully. "His carriage left at dawn." Of course it had. Adrian Blackwood seemed to vanish whenever tenderness threatened proximity. Eleanor thanked them quietly and crossed toward the dressing table after they departed. Her fingertips hovered above the sapphire necklace once more. She should have despised the gift. Instead, confusion stirred within her chest like restless music. A man determined upon revenge would not surrender his dead mother's jewels so intimately. By afternoon, Ravenshire Manor transformed into a theater of aristocratic obligation. Invitations arrived for winter gatherings, charity concerts and formal dinners, though Eleanor quickly recognized the poisoned civility hidden beneath elegant handwriting. Society did not invite her from affection, they invited her because humiliation had become fashionable entertainment. 3 evenings later, she entered the grand ballroom of Halstead House beneath a blaze of crystal chandeliers, and ruthless attention conversations faltered as she descended the staircase alone. Hundreds of candles reflected across polished marble floors while a string quartet played beneath garlands of white roses. Diamonds flashed at noblewomen's throats like sharpened ice. Eleanor felt every stare touch her skin. "There she is," Somion whispered nearby. "The revenge bride. Heard the Duke scarcely speaks to her." She continued forward with measured grace, refusing to permit the cruelty surrounding her any visible victory. Her silver gown swept softly across the floor, moonlight woven into silk. Yet isolation followed her through the ballroom like another shadow. Then Lady Beatrice Whitmore appeared. Beatrice possessed the golden beauty society adored without question. Honey-colored curls, perfect posture, and the effortless confidence of a woman long accustomed to admiration. Rumor had paired her name beside Adrian's for years. Many believed she would eventually become Duchess of Ravenshire herself. "How courageous of you to attend tonight," Beatrice remarked sweetly, though triumph glittered behind her smile. "Most ladies would require months to recover from such public embarrassment." Several nearby guests pretended not to listen. Eleanor answered calmly. "Fortunately, I have never possessed the luxury of fragility." Beatrice's fan snapped open. "Still, one wonders how it feels to marry a man who announced his hatred before the altar itself." The words landed precisely as intended. A painful hush spread through the surrounding circle. Eleanor sensed curiosity tightening around her like silk cords. They wished to see whether humiliation might finally crack her composure. Before she could respond, another voice interrupted. "That will be enough, Lady Beatrice." Adrian stood several feet away, dressed in severe black evening attire that rendered him impossibly striking against the candlelit ballroom. The musicians faltered briefly at his arrival. He crossed toward Eleanor with measured calm, though restrained anger darkened his expression. Beatrice recovered first. "Your Grace, I merely expressed concern for your wife." "My wife requires no defense from you," Adrian replied. Shock flickered openly across the ballroom. Eleanor herself nearly stared. Without another word, Adrian extended his hand toward her. "Dance with me." The command carried little warmth, yet it shattered society's expectations all the same. Eleanor placed her fingers against his gloved palm. Moments later, he guided her into the center of the ballroom as the orchestra resumed a slow waltz. Whispering erupted immediately around them. Dozens of eyes followed every movement they made beneath the golden chandeliers. Adrian's hand settled carefully against her waist. The contact burned through layers of silk. "You should not have intervened," Eleanor murmured while they turned across the marble floor. "She insulted the Duchess of Ravenshire publicly. And that troubles you." His gaze held hers steadily. "Do not mistake rescue for tenderness." Eleanor lifted her chin slightly. "And do not mistake dignity for weakness, Your Grace." For the briefest instant, amusement ghosted across his face before vanishing again beneath restraint. Yet the flicker transformed him entirely. She suddenly glimpsed the man he might have been before bitterness hardened every corner of his heart. The dance ended too quickly. Adrian escorted her from the ballroom without another intimate word, though his hand lingered at her back 1 second longer than propriety required. Guests parted before them in astonished silence. Later that night, Eleanor returned to Ravenshire Manor exhausted by scrutiny and unspoken tension. Rain tapped softly against the library windows downstairs while distant clocks marked midnight. As she entered her chambers, the scent of fresh white roses greeted her unexpectedly. A bouquet rested beside the hearth. Confused, Eleanor approached. Slowly nestled among the flowers lay a leather-bound volume of poetry by her favorite childhood author, its worn spine identical to the copy she had once treasured before her family's downfall. No card accompanied the gift. Yet as she opened the book, a folded letter slipped quietly into her lap. Her breath caught. The elegant handwriting belonged unmistakably to Adrian's mother. And across the first line, written years before either feud or marriage, were the words, "If our children inherit our hatred, then God help them both." Outside, thunder rolled beyond the manor hills while Eleanor stared at the fading ink, suddenly wondering whether revenge had consumed innocent hearts first. Thunder gathered above Ravenshire Manor for 3 relentless days, wrapping the ancient estate in shadows and restless wind. Rain swept across the towering windows and silver sheets while servants hurried through dim corridors carrying candles against the gloom. Eleanor spent those storm-bound hours within the Western Library, surrounded by dust-veiled shelves and the lingering scent of old parchment, searching desperately for meaning hidden between the faded lines of forgotten letters. The note written by Adrian's mother refused to leave her thoughts. "If our children inherit our hatred, then God help them both." Those words transformed every memory of Adrian's cruelty into something less certain and far more dangerous. Hatred alone could explain humiliation. It could not explain white roses left beside her bed, nor childhood poetry wrapped with such careful silence. Eleanor had begun to sense another emotion buried beneath his vengeance, something wounded enough to disguise itself as contempt. Lightning flashed beyond the library windows as she unfolded another brittle document discovered inside a locked cabinet. Most concerned parliamentary disputes between the Ashcombes and Blackwoods decades earlier. Financial accusations. Land disagreements. Political alliances shattered behind velvet curtains. Yet one letter, dated nearly 20 years before her birth, seized her attention immediately. The handwriting belonged to her father. Edmund Ashcombe had written directly to Adrian's mother. "I never intended your husband's ruin. Someone altered the accounts before Parliament received them. By the time I discovered the deception, the damage had already spread beyond repair." Eleanor reread the sentence slowly, disbelief tightening inside her chest. Her father had always remained strangely silent whenever the Blackwood scandal surfaced during her childhood. She once assumed guilt explained that silence. Now uncertainty bloomed where certainty once stood. A floorboard creaked behind her. She turned sharply. Adrian stood within the doorway, rainwater darkening the shoulders of his coat. Storm light carved hard shadows across his face while his gaze settled upon the papers scattered before her. "You should not be here," he said quietly. "Then perhaps you should stop leaving ghosts inside unlocked cabinets." His expression hardened instantly. "Those letters concern matters buried long ago." "They concern our families," Eleanor replied. "And perhaps the truth." For several moments neither moved. Thunder rolled above the manor while candle flames trembled between them. Adrian crossed slowly into the library at last, removing his gloves with measured restraint. Eleanor noticed exhaustion beneath his composure, as though the storm outside had somehow followed him indoors. "My father believed yours betrayed him deliberately," Adrian said. "That belief destroyed him long before death arrived. And if he was mistaken?" Adrian's jaw tightened. "Mistakes do not erase graves." The bitterness in his voice carried genuine grief rather than cold arrogance. For the first time, Eleanor glimpsed the sun hidden beneath the Duke. A lonely young man raised beside ruin, taught to nurture resentment because sorrow felt too vulnerable to survive otherwise. Another crash of thunder shook the manor violently. Before either could speak again, the library doors slammed shut behind them as fierce winds swept through the corridor. Candles flickered wildly. Somewhere deeper within the estate, servants shouted in alarm. Adrian strode toward the doors immediately, but the ancient lock jammed stubbornly. "The storm damaged the west wing last winter," he muttered. "These doors often swell during heavy rain." Eleanor crossed her arms lightly. "So the Duke of Ravenshire finds himself imprisoned beside his own wife." Something unexpectedly soft touched Adrian's eyes. "Cruel fate indeed." The reply carried the faintest trace of humor. Eleanor nearly smiled before remembering herself. Silence settled afterward, quieter than before, no longer sharpened entirely by hostility. Rain battered the windows while firelight painted amber reflections across the dark wood shelves surrounding them. Adrian approached the hearth slowly. "You endured the ballroom better than most women would have. Most women are not displayed as punishment before society." His gaze lowered briefly. "No." The single word sounded dangerously close to regret. Eleanor studied him carefully. "Why give me your mother's necklace?" Adrian remained still for several seconds before answering, "Because she would have hated the man I became after her death." The honesty startled her. She believed mercy was a greater inheritance than pride. He continued quietly. "My father disagreed." "And you?" A shadow crossed his expression. "I no longer know." Lightning illuminated the room brilliantly for one suspended moment, revealing exhaustion etched into every severe line of his face. Eleanor suddenly understood that revenge had not satisfied him. It had merely imprisoned him inside old grief. Without speaking, Adrian withdrew the sapphire necklace from his coat pocket. Eleanor stared in surprise. "You carried it with you." "I intended to return it to the vault tonight." He stepped closer, yet somehow I could not. The storm seemed to hush around them. Adrian lifted the necklace carefully, his gloved fingers brushing the curve of her neck as he fastened the sapphires against her skin. The touch lasted only seconds, yet warmth traveled through Eleanor with alarming force. She looked up instinctively and found him watching her not with hatred, but with something far more conflicted. "If revenge was truly all you desired," she whispered, "why do you look at me as though I wound you?" Adrian's breathing slowed. "Because you were never supposed to matter," his eyes seemed to confess, though the words never reached his lips. A sudden pounding erupted outside the library doors. Moments later, Adrian's steward forced them open with visible panic upon his pale face. "Your Grace," the man said breathlessly, clutching a rain-soaked newspaper, "London already knows." Adrian took the paper sharply. Eleanor watched the color drain from his face as his eyes reached the headline printed across the front page. "The Duke of Ravenshire's bride, a marriage of calculated humiliation." Beneath the title rested detailed accusations describing Adrian's intention to destroy her publicly from the beginning, alongside private correspondence apparently proving every cruel suspicion society already whispered behind closed doors. Eleanor stared at him, realizing trust had become far more terrifying than humiliation was. Dawn crept across Ravenshire Manor like a reluctant witness, pale light filtering through rain-streaked windows while silence settled heavily over the estate. Eleanor had not slept. The newspaper remained crumpled beside the dying fire, its brutal headline burned into her thoughts with merciless clarity. Every cruel suspicion she had fought to silence now stood before her in printed ink. Adrian had intended to humiliate her from the beginning. Society had merely enjoyed the spectacle before she herself recognized it. She stood at the window wearing a dark traveling cloak over her nightdress, staring toward the distant hills swallowed by mist. Behind her, the sapphire necklace rested upon the dressing table beside her wedding ring. Together they resembled the remains of two entirely different marriages, one born from bitterness, the other from fragile hope neither of them had trusted enough to name aloud. A quiet knock sounded at the chamber door. "Come in," Eleanor said without turning. Adrian entered cautiously. Exhaustion shadowed his face, and the severe elegance he carried so effortlessly now seemed burdened by strain. For several moments he simply watched her standing before the gray morning light, as though uncertain whether approaching would heal or destroy what remained between them. "The article is true," Eleanor said before he could speak. "You married me for revenge." Adrian's silence answered first. "Yes," he admitted finally. "At the beginning." The words sliced more deeply because he offered them honestly. Eleanor turned slowly toward him. "And when precisely did your hatred become inconvenient?" Pain flickered across his expression. "You believe I orchestrated the article. Did you not?" "No," he stepped closer. "I would never have exposed you to public ridicule again." Again. The single word carried unexpected remorse. Yet Eleanor found herself too wounded to trust remorse any longer. She remembered the cathedral, the whispers, the ballroom stares sharpened by gossip. Every humiliation now seemed carefully designed rather than impulsively cruel. "You should have hated me openly," she whispered. "It would have been kinder than confusing me with moments of tenderness." Adrian's composure fractured slightly. Tenderness was never part of the plan. "And yet you offered it." The accusation lingered between them with painful intimacy. Outside, rain tapped softly against the windows while distant servants moved through the halls below, unaware their duke and duchess stood upon the edge of ruin. Adrian lowered his gaze briefly. "I did not expect you to be gentle." Eleanor almost laughed at the tragedy of it. "You punished me for sins I never committed, then seemed astonished to discover I possessed a heart." His jaw tightened. "You are not your father." "No," she said quietly. "And perhaps you are not entirely the monster you pretend to be either. That is what makes this unbearable." For the first time since entering the room, Adrian looked genuinely shaken. Eleanor crossed toward the dressing table and removed the sapphire necklace slowly from her throat. Candlelight flickered across the blue stones as she placed them beside the ring. Adrian watched the gesture with visible restraint, though anguish darkened his eyes. "My mother treasured those sapphires," he said softly. "Then they deserve better than becoming instruments of apology." The silence that followed felt endless. At last Adrian reached inside his coat and withdrew several folded letters tied with faded ribbon. He placed them carefully upon the table between them. "I spent the entire night in the archives beneath Parliament," he said. "Your father did not betray my family willingly. Another man altered the financial records before they were presented publicly. By the time the truth surfaced, both our families had already been destroyed by the scandal." Eleanor stared at the letters in disbelief. "Who?" she breathed. "Lord Pembroke." Adrian's voice roughened with restrained fury. "He manipulated both houses to secure political power. My father discovered the deception shortly before his death, but grief consumed him before he could repair the damage." Eleanor felt the room tilt around her. All those years of hatred, gossip, disgrace, and revenge had grown from deliberate lies crafted by a stranger hungry for influence. Her father had carried shame to his grave for crimes he never intended to commit. "You knew none of this when you married me," she said slowly. "No. But you know it now." Adrian stepped nearer until only inches separated them. "Yes." "Then why do you still look at me as though forgiveness terrifies you?" His breathing faltered. "Because I do not deserve it," he confessed. The raw honesty in his voice shattered the last fragile wall protecting Eleanor's anger. She saw suddenly not the untouchable Duke of Ravenshire, but a lonely man raised inside inherited bitterness until cruelty became the only language he trusted. Loving him would always require stepping willingly toward danger. A carriage rattled violently into the courtyard below. Moments later, hurried footsteps echoed through the corridor. Adrian's steward burst into the chamber without ceremony, pale with alarm. "Your Grace," he said breathlessly, "Lord Pembroke has arrived." Adrian's expression hardened instantly. "What does he want?" The steward swallowed. "He claims to possess evidence concerning Lady Eleanor's father. He insists the Duchess must hear it personally." Eleanor felt cold dread slide through her chest. Adrian moved protectively before her at once, his voice turning lethal with controlled fury. "He will not come near her." But before another word could be spoken, a second voice drifted calmly from the open doorway behind the steward. "I fear, Your Grace," Lord Pembroke said, stepping slowly into the room, "that your wife already belongs at the center of this scandal far more than either of you yet understands." Eleanor's pulse thundered as the older nobleman removed his gloves with deliberate elegance. Adrian positioned himself between them instinctively, broad shoulders rigid beneath the weak morning light. Yet Pembroke's gaze never left Eleanor. "Your father protected someone before he died," he murmured softly. "Unless you learn whom, Duchess, this marriage will become the smallest tragedy attached to your family's name before the winter finally ends completely." Lord Pembroke carried the scent of winter rain and expensive tobacco into the chamber, though neither masked the decay lurking beneath his polished civility. He stood with measured elegance beside the doorway, silver hair immaculate despite the storm outside, his pale gloves folded carefully within one hand. Eleanor understood immediately why powerful men trusted him. He possessed the calm voice of a gentleman and the eyes of someone who had buried many truths without remorse. Adrian did not move aside. "You will leave this room," the Duke said coldly. "Before I forget, you are my guest." Pembroke's expression barely shifted. Still protective even now. Fascinating. "Speak plainly," Eleanor demanded. "What did my father protect?" For the first time, something resembling pity crossed the older man's face. "He protected your mother, Duchess." The word struck harder than any insult. Eleanor felt the blood drain from her cheeks. Her mother had died when Eleanor was 12, gentle and fragile after years of illness. No scandal had ever touched her memory. Even Adrian glanced back sharply in surprise. Pembroke stepped farther into the room. "Your mother discovered evidence capable of destroying several noble families, including mine. She intended to reveal financial corruption inside Parliament." His smile thinned slightly. "Your father loved her enough to sacrifice his own reputation instead." "You lie," Adrian said. "Do I?" Pembroke withdrew a worn document from his coat pocket and handed it toward Eleanor. "Read the signature." Her fingers trembled as she unfolded the paper. It was a sworn statement written in her mother's hand, detailing bribery, altered accounts, and names belonging to influential men across London society. At the bottom rested her father's signature beside a final sentence written hastily in darker ink. "I accept full responsibility to protect my wife and daughter from retaliation." Eleanor's breath caught painfully. Every cruel rumor, every ruined fortune, every year of disgrace her father endured had been chosen deliberately to shield their family from dangerous men. "He carried the blame because silence kept you alive," Pembroke said softly. "Unfortunately, your husband inherited vengeance before he inherited truth." Adrian's face darkened with horror. For several seconds the storm outside seemed to vanish entirely beneath the crushing silence filling the chamber. Eleanor remembered her father sitting alone for hours beside dying fires, staring toward windows with exhausted eyes while society mocked him beyond closed doors. She had mistaken his silence for shame. In reality it had been sacrifice. "You destroyed him," she whispered. Pembroke shrugged lightly. "Men destroy themselves for love every day." Adrian surged forward with sudden fury, seizing the older nobleman by the collar. "You manipulated both our families for decades. And you continued my work beautifully," Pembroke replied without fear. "You humiliated an innocent woman publicly while society applauded your cruelty. I merely provided the stage." Eleanor watched Adrian's expression fracture beneath those words. The Duke released Pembroke abruptly, as though disgusted by his own reflection within the accusation. "Get out," Adrian said hoarsely. Pembroke adjusted his coat calmly. "Gladly. London already whispers that your marriage is collapsing, Your Grace. By tomorrow they shall learn precisely why." He turned toward Eleanor before departing. "Your father died protecting dignity," he murmured. "Do not waste yours on a man who learned too late what love required." Then he disappeared into the corridor, leaving silence behind him like smoke after gunfire. Adrian stood motionless near the window, rain shadowing the harsh lines of his face. For once he seemed stripped entirely of title and pride. Eleanor realized the truth had wounded him almost as deeply as it wounded her. Revenge had become the foundation of his identity. Now that foundation lay in ruins. "You should go after him," she said quietly. "He is not what matters. But he ruined both our lives." Adrian turned toward her slowly. "No, I ruined ours." The raw honesty in his voice nearly undid her composure. He crossed the room carefully, like a man approaching something sacred after years spent destroying beautiful things with careless hands. "Your father protected his family at the cost of his own name," he said, "and I repaid that sacrifice by humiliating his daughter before the entire kingdom." Eleanor lowered her gaze. "You believed the lies. I wanted to believe them." Pain roughened every word. Hatred was simpler than grief. The confession lingered between them with terrible intimacy. Outside, the storm began to weaken. Pale afternoon light slipped through the clouds, touching the sapphire necklace still resting upon the dressing table. Adrian looked toward it briefly before speaking again. "When I first saw you at St. Bartholomew's," he admitted quietly, "I intended to make you suffer exactly as I had suffered. I convinced myself your tears would heal something inside me. His jaw tightened. Instead, every moment of your humiliation became another shame I could not escape. Eleanor's chest ached unexpectedly. She had spent weeks fearing his cruelty while slowly discovering the loneliness hidden beneath it. Loving him had never been safe. Yet neither had forgetting him. You wounded me deeply, she whispered. I know. And part of me still hates you for it. You should. A sad smile touched her lips despite herself. There you are again, encouraging my anger. It is the only thing I deserve. For the first time since the cathedral, Eleanor saw no bitterness inside him at all. Only remorse. Only a weary man standing amid the wreckage of pride he no longer wished to defend. Adrian stepped closer. But if there remains even the smallest possibility that I may someday earn your forgiveness, I will spend the rest of my life pursuing it. The sincerity in his voice stripped away her final defenses. Not because he was powerful. Not because he was handsome. But because the man before her no longer hid behind vengeance. A fire cracked softly within the hearth. Eleanor studied him in silence before finally crossing toward the dressing table. Adrian watched carefully as she lifted the sapphire necklace once more. Blue light shimmered across the stones like fragments of midnight sky. My mother believed mercy mattered more than pride, she said softly. She was wiser than either of us. Eleanor turned toward him slowly. Then perhaps we have both inherited the wrong things. Before fear could silence her, she stepped nearer and placed the necklace gently into his hands. Put it on me, she whispered. Adrian stared at her with visible disbelief. Then, with trembling restraint, he moved behind her and fastened the sapphires carefully around her throat. His fingers brushed her skin only briefly, yet the touch carried more tenderness than any embrace either had imagined possible months earlier. When Eleanor turned back toward him, emotion flickered openly across his face at last. You once told me to remove the wedding dress because our marriage was born from revenge, she said quietly. But revenge does not survive truth very gracefully. Adrian lifted one shaking hand toward her cheek, hesitating as though afraid she might vanish. Nor does pride survive love, he murmured. This time Eleanor did not step away. Outside, the rain finally ceased above Ravenshire Manor. Evening sunlight broke through retreating clouds, bathing the ancient estate in gold after weeks of endless gray. Down below, servants opened windows to fresh air while distant bells echoed across the hills. And inside the quiet chamber where hatred had nearly destroyed them both, the Duke of Ravenshire lowered himself to one knee before his wife, not from duty nor revenge nor scandal, but from love powerful enough to humble the proudest man in England. Eleanor's eyes filled softly as Adrian looked up at her with devastating sincerity. May I begin again, he asked, as the husband you deserved from the very first moment I saw you standing beneath those cathedral lights? For one suspended heartbeat, the world seemed to wait with him. Then Eleanor placed her trembling hand in his.